The thin linen envelope slid across the mahogany table with a soft, dismissive sound. It stopped right next to my crystal water glass. Slightly crooked, an unwelcome intruder in the perfect symmetry of the dinner setting. I looked at it, then up at Patricia. Evan's mother was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a shark might give before it decides you're worth eating. "Open it, dear," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Consider it an investment in your future." My future? I glanced at Evan. He was staring intensely at his plate of barely touched sea bass, refusing to meet my eyes. My stomach tightened. I picked up the envelope. It felt light, insignificant. Inside were 15 crisp $100 bills. $1,500. I looked up, confused. "Is this a gift?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Patricia laughed. A tinkling sound that matched the expensive crystal around us. "Oh, heavens no. It's an etiquette stipend. We call it the Grace Improvement Fund." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone at the table could hear perfectly. "Evan's tenure review is coming up. And honestly, darling, that rural look of yours, it's charming in a quaint sort of way, but it won't do for the faculty dinner. We need you polished, fixed, before you embarrass him." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at the money in my hand, then at Evan, waiting for him to speak, to defend me, to say something, anything. But he just kept cutting his fish, the knife scraping against the porcelain in a rhythmic, cowardly cadence. Before I tell you what I did with that envelope, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see how far this story travels. I didn't wear that dress to insult them. I wore it because in my real life, I don't dress for an audience. I dress for the lab. I live in Wicker Park, the gritty, artistic heart of Chicago, where the coffee is strong and the people are too busy creating things to care about the thread count of your linen. That was where I met Evan. He was sitting in a corner booth at my regular cafe, grading papers with the intense, furrowed brow of a man who believes he is the only person in the room thinking deep thoughts. I was wearing a hoodie, frantically typing out a grant rejection appeal on my phone. He saw a frazzled, struggling researcher. He saw someone who needed saving. And Evan loved being a savior. For 2 years, he played the role of the intellectual provider. He loved explaining history to me. Loved buying me dinner at mid-range Italian restaurants with the benevolent air of a king feeding a peasant. He loved the idea that he, the history professor with the prestigious family name, was the stable one, the rock. He never asked about the specifics of my work. To him, my biotech research was just cute science experiments, a hobby that barely paid the rent. He didn't know that 18 months ago, my startup was acquired by a major pharmaceutical conglomerate. He didn't know that the grant rejection he saw me typing was actually a negotiation for a licensing deal worth millions. He didn't know that my monthly dividend check was roughly what he earned in 2 years. I didn't tell him, not because I wanted to trick him, but because I needed to protect myself. I call it the armor of invisibility. When you are a young woman in high-stakes tech, money changes the way people look at you. It turns you from a person into an opportunity. Men stop looking at your eyes and start looking at your net worth. They either become intimidated and leave, or they become hungry and stay for the wrong reasons. I had been burned before by men who loved my ambition until it started out earning them. So, I put on the armor. I let the world see the messy bun and the worn-out sneakers. I let them see the struggling scientist. It was a filter. I wanted to know if someone could love Grace. Just Grace, the girl who burns toast and cries at dog commercials, without the golden halo of success. I wanted to be loved for my soul, not my solvency. I thought Evan was the one. I thought he loved me for my mind, for my quiet resilience. I didn't realize until tonight, sitting at this table under the cold gaze of his mother, that he didn't love me for who I was. He loved me for who he was when he was with me. He loved feeling superior. He loved the contrast. I wasn't his partner. I was his charity case. And looking at the $1,500 sitting on the table, I realized that to his family, I wasn't even that. I was a stain they were trying to bleach out. Patricia was still smiling, waiting for me to take the money, to say thank you, to be grateful for her insults. She thought she was looking at a poor girl who would do anything to belong. She had no idea she was looking at the woman who could buy her entire neighborhood. The armor had worked too well. It had shown me exactly who they were, and now it was time to take it off. The envelope was just the opening act. The main event walked through the door 5 minutes later. Her name was Vanessa. She was Evan's ex-girlfriend, the daughter of a Swiss diplomat. And, according to Patricia, she had just happened to be in the neighborhood. She floated into the dining room, wearing silk that cost more than my car, apologizing effortlessly for the interruption while Richard, Evan's father, practically tripped over himself to pull out a chair. They sat her right next to Evan. I was sitting across from them, suddenly feeling like an audience member in my own breakup. This wasn't a dinner party anymore. It was a live dissection. Patricia didn't just welcome Vanessa. She weaponized her. She spent the next 20 minutes conducting a forensic comparison between the two of us. She asked Vanessa about her recent gallery opening in Milan. She asked me if I had found a coupon for the wine I didn't bring. She praised Vanessa's lineage and breeding, words that belong in a kennel club, not a family dinner. And then came the moment that made the air leave the room. Patricia reached out and took Vanessa's hand, holding it up like a prize exhibit. "Look at these fingers," she cooed. "Long, elegant, unblemished piano hands. That is what refinement looks like." Then her eyes snapped to me. She didn't touch me. She just pointed a manicured nail at my hands, which were resting on the tablecloth. "Grace, dear," she said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "Your hands, they look like you've been gardening without gloves. The skin is so rough. Have you tried lemon juice? Or perhaps just keeping them in your pockets?" I looked down at my hands. They were dry. There was a small chemical burn on my left index finger from a liquid nitrogen splash 3 weeks ago. My cuticles were ragged because I pick at them when I'm debugging code at 3 o'clock in the morning. They weren't elegant. They were the hands of a builder. These hands had built a sequencing machine that was currently being used to identify rare genetic markers in pediatric cancer. These hands had signed the paperwork that secured the financial freedom of everyone in my company. They were tools, not ornaments. To Patricia, they were just ugly. I looked at Evan. This was his moment. This was the point where a partner says, "Her hands are fine, mother." Or, "She works hard." And I love that about her. I waited. I watched him take a sip of the vintage wine that suddenly tasted like vinegar in my mouth. He didn't look at my hands. He looked at Vanessa and he smiled. It was a small, nostalgic smile, the kind you give to a road not taken. In that silence, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I realized that to Evan, Vanessa was a mirror reflecting the life he thought he deserved. Art galleries, diplomats, ease. I was a mirror reflecting the life he feared. Work, struggle, reality. He wasn't just a coward. He was a snob who liked to visit the working class but didn't want to live there. The crystal glass in my hand felt heavy, cold, and fragile. Just like the illusion of this relationship. The appetizers were cleared, but the taste of inadequacy lingered. Richard, Evan's father, decided it was his turn to carve. He didn't pick up the carving knife, though. He picked up my career. "So, Grace," he said, swirling his wine as if he were aerating a fine opinion. "Evan tells us you're still working at that incubator. It must be fun playing with test tubes. I always thought biology was charming like baking, but with bacteria." The table chuckled. It was a polite, practiced chuckle, the kind you learn in boarding school. Even Evan managed a weak smile, murmuring something about how passionate I was. "It's actually genomics, Richard," I said, my voice steady. "We focus on CRISPR technology and gene editing for hereditary diseases." "Fascinating," Richard said, clearly bored. "But is it sustainable? I mean, really, dear. Chasing grants must be exhausting." Vanessa here was just telling us about her father's work with you, and now that is impact. Real-world application, not just cute science experiments. Cute. The word hung in the air like a dead weight. A year ago, that word would have crushed me. I would have stuttered. I tried to explain the complexity of my algorithms. Tried to prove that I mattered. But tonight, something shifted. I stopped looking at them as giants. I put on my scientist glasses. I stopped listening to the noise and started looking at the data. And the data was telling a very different story. I looked at Richard, really looked at him. I noticed that while his suit was bespoke, the fabric at the cuff was fraying just slightly. It wasn't the shabby chic of the comfortably wealthy. It was the wear of a man who hasn't bought a new suit in 5 years because he can't justify the expense. I looked at the walls. There were pale rectangular outlines where paintings used to hang. They had been moved or more likely sold. I looked at Patricia. When the server poured the last of the wine, her eyes didn't track the conversation. They tracked the bottle. Her knuckles were white. It was a micro-expression of pure panic. She wasn't worried about etiquette. She was worried about inventory. She was terrified of running out because she couldn't afford to go to the cellar for another vintage of this caliber. Suddenly, the glass castle theory clicked into place. In my world, we analyze systems under stress to find their breaking points. I realized then that this family wasn't attacking me because they were strong. They were attacking me because they were terrified. They were asset-rich but cash-poor. Living in a museum they could no longer afford to heat. They were trapped in a legacy that was eating them alive. My rural look and my struggling scientist persona threatened them, not because I was less than them, but because I was free. I had liquidity. I had a future that wasn't tied to a decaying estate. They needed to believe I was small so they could feel big. Their cruelty wasn't a display of power. It was a symptom of their impending collapse. I took a sip of water. The anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical pity. They weren't the judges. They were the defendants. And I was the only one in the room who knew the verdict. It can be exhausting, I said finally, agreeing with Richard just to watch him relax. But sometimes the experiments pay off in ways you don't expect. I turned to Patricia. Speaking of paying off, you mentioned I might need help finding a job. Patricia brightened, sensing a kill. Well, yes. Richard has connections at the museum. They always need receptionists. It's steady work, Grace. Reliable. It would help you contribute until Evan gets tenure. Of course. She smiled, waiting for me to be grateful for the crumbs. It was time to show her the whole loaf. I set my fork down. The soft clink against the china sounded like a gavel strike in the silent room. Actually, Patricia, I said, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of the apology she was expecting. I don't think I'll be needing a receptionist job. Oh. She raised a sculpted eyebrow. Are you holding out for something better? Beggars can't be choosers, dear. I'm not a beggar, I said, and I've already chosen. I leaned back in my chair, steady and unbothered. My startup wasn't just funded, Richard. It was acquired 18 months ago by Novartis. His glass froze midair. For how much? Enough that my monthly dividend is $85,000. The room fell silent. Patricia stared at the $1,500 she had just handed me as if it were toy money. Evan sputtered. But you worry about rent. I worry about payroll and burn rate, I said. I live in Wicker Park because I like it, not because I need to. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. To see if you loved me, or just the idea of being above me. I turned to his parents. Your etiquette stipend was enlightening. Richard tried to recover. He bragged that their foundation had secured a $2 million angel donor who would wire funds in the morning. I know, I said. I'm the donor. I slid my phone across the table. On the screen, donor, Grace Miller. Amount, $2 million. Scheduled. Their faces collapsed. Richard whispered, but you're broke. I'm an investor, and I funded your foundation anonymously because Evan told me how much this house meant to you. I thought saving your legacy might earn me a seat at this table. I tapped the screen. Transaction canceled. Richard's phone chimed. The color drained from his face. The endowment was gone. Charity must be embarrassing for people like you, I said, standing. Evan begged. Grace. I love you. We can fix this. No. You loved the idea of saving me. I never needed saving. I walked out, leaving the envelope behind. The next morning, I redirected the $2 million, not back to myself, but to the University of Chicago to create the Dignity Scholarship for underprivileged girls in STEM. 6 months later, the estate was sold. Evan tried calling. I never picked up. I was too busy opening my new lab. 45 employees depending on me. I still wear my messy bun and my sneakers. And on late nights, looking at the Chicago skyline, I smile. Not because I'm wealthy, but because I finally chose my worth for myself.